Well, I'd like to welcome you to our Drought 2021 Ideas Around the Table presentation. The presenter for this session is Julie Elliott she's the Rangeland Management Specialist with USDA's NRCS and the Wray office here in Yuma County. And she's going to be talking about grassland endurance. So we're going to turn this over to Julie for her presentation. Julie, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Travis. I'm sure pleased to get to participate in this Zoom meeting, and I hope that the information I provide is helpful to all of you. So it's important that we understand how grass grows, how it responds to grazing and drought, and the long-term effects of drought, and how to plan for recovery. As Travis said, I'm Julie Elliott. I'm with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Many of you in Yuma County know me. I've been here since 2002, based out of Wray as a Rangeland Management Specialist. So today I want to explore the how of grass growth, these ideas of long-term effects of drought, and how we go about the process of planning for recovery. If we want to understand how drought impacts grass, and therefore how to best manage for, during, and after drought, we must first understand how grass grows. Now, while that might seem obvious to some of you, I've learned over the years that there are many different beliefs out there about how grass grows. And I've had ranchers get pretty darn agitated at me because they thought I wasn't being fair when I was comparing the grass inside of an exclusion cage to the grass outside the exclusion cage. And it was all rooted in their understanding of how grass grows. So I promise I will not turn this into a college plant biology 101 lecture with lots of technical terms. Let's just step out on the range and have a conversation about how grass grows. So in the spring or early summer, buds at or just underneath the surface of the soil start to grow. So like a seed, that energy stored in the bud is what fuels the growth for the leaves until they can start turning sunlight into energy, called photosynthesis. This, of course, requires that there's enough moisture in the soil for the plant to get started at all. Okay, first misunderstanding. The brown grass that's on your range will not turn green. The term green back up is really pretty misleading. The brown stuff out there does not green back up. The new buds start growing at the soil level and grow over the top of the brown stuff out there. So when you have something that keeps livestock out of an area, for example, an iron keepsake or some wire laying out there, that grass is tall because it grew, is not tall because it grew and then regrew back on top of itself. It's tall because it has all the roots underneath it that it can need to support that top growth. So maybe it would be better to say that grass doesn't grow like your kids or your grandkids or your pants waist size. It starts over every year from new buds. So the notable exception of this are the early grasses: western wheatgrass, needle and thread, the dreaded cheatgrass. These all start in the fall if conditions are right, or even during the winter if it's mild. And then they go dormant when it gets cold enough. Then in the spring, usually March or so, they'll green back up, they'll grow, then set their seed heads, or in this case of cheatgrass, it dies. So if something comes along and takes off enough leaves that the remaining ones cannot make the needed energy for the plant to continue growing, the plant will burn off some roots and energy reserves so it can regrow the leaves to the point that they can start making the energy the plant needs again. When growing conditions in the remaining leaf biomass is good, this can take just a few days or weeks for the leaves to regrow and start producing more energy than they need for growth. That extra energy then goes to the roots that the plant uses to get growing again. So here's a great illustration. These are two plants, same species. They were trimmed off. One was trimmed off at the 2-inch height. One was trimmed off at the 9-inch height. Then 6 days later, this photo was taken. Look at the regrowth for the plant that was trimmed at 9 inches. Look at the regrowth for the plant that was trimmed off at 2. It didn't even reach the 9-inch mark for the previous plant. How hard the grass is grazed, or in this case, how short it cuts, makes a difference on how long it takes to start regrowing. These two pictures are great illustrations of just how much root mass is underneath. There's 90% of a perennial plant is underneath the ground. If the leaves get removed low enough that they cannot make enough energy to fuel regrowth, the process repeats and the plant has to burn off some roots and the energy reserves to fuel that leaf growth. So we start to run into trouble, as you can imagine from the earlier slide, when the plant loses too many leaves too many times. So the leaves grow up, they get taken off, the plant burns off some roots. To regrow the leaves get taken off, the plant burns off some roots. It regrows the leaves get taken off, it regrows some roots. If this happens too many times, then eventually that plant runs out of roots. And those roots keep getting shorter and shorter throughout the year. It doesn't matter how much moisture is in the soil at 2 feet or 4 feet or 6 feet or 10 feet, if your roots are only 1.5 feet deep. Additionally, plants lose about 30% of the roots every year, just like we shed our skin cells. The plant must be photosynthesizing more energy than it is using to stay alive before it can grow leaves, and even more energy before it can start to regrow the roots. If growing conditions are not good, root growth just stops completely. Additionally, if 60% of the total leaf volume is removed, 50% of the root growth is stopped. If 80% or more of the total leaf volume is removed, root growth stops completely for 12 to 18 days before enough energy is mobilized from the roots to feed growth. And this is in good conditions. Roots do far more than just access moisture and nutrients and provide an energy source for regrowing leaves. They also serve as energy storage for winter. Perennial grasses are dormant in the wintertime. They're not dead. Think of them as a sleeping, hibernating bear. That bear just plumped himself all up in the fall, goes to sleep in the wintertime, slowly burns off those fat reserves through the winter, just keeping himself alive. Wakes up in the spring starving to death, and look out, anybody who stands in his way. Well, plants are similar. They're burning those leaves off through the winter time, or burning those roots off through the winter just to stay alive. If they run out of roots, just like if the bear runs out of fat, they don't wake up in the spring, they die. One more point about grass growth. If temperatures are not right, or if they are short of water, the plant will just sit there until things get better. Now, the plants might be green if there's enough water to keep the plant from growing dormant. Okay, second misunderstanding, green does not mean growing. It means photosynthesis is happening. They're making energy to keep from growing dormant, but they're not necessarily growing. And we've all seen this in our crops and in our gardens. Think of times when you've seen crops planted out there and they're just sitting. They're green, but they're just sitting. My peppers last year are a perfect example. I planted them, and at the end of the year, they were only a few inches taller than when I planted them, and they should have been a foot or 15 inches taller. They just sat there. I watered them, I fed them. Something wasn't right, and they just didn't grow. So plants need to have enough leaf material to support top growth, to set new buds, to regrow roots that burned off after that first bite, if that first bite was short enough that they had to burn the roots, it didn't leave enough green. Plus, they have to regrow roots lost as normal part of life. Root regrowing time is measured in months, not in days or even in weeks. Green does not mean growing. So let's take a clear look. Where are we today, February of 2021? Has the drought broken? Or are we facing another year of some level of drought? How do we know when we can start grazing, or how long the animal can stay, or when they need to come off? Is it okay to be feeding in the winter, or even next spring or next summer? How do we make management decisions when we don't know where we are, or where are we going? How can we make sure those decisions impact us positively and not negatively, both the range survival, which our business is critical to? It's like asking, is this picture a sunrise or a sunset? So let's start by looking at where we've been. Let's figure out where we are today, and let's plan for tomorrow. Drought with 75% or less of long-term cumulative average precipitation happens in Northeast Colorado about 50% of the time. For some folks, it's been more like 81% since 2002. I think everyone listening will agree that last year was a drought year. For some, it was their second or even third year of drought in a row. The drought monitor right now has the plains of Colorado from a D1 to D3, at least our northeast section. But it can't pick up those nuances of rain or snow at the neighbors that doesn't happen at your place. So your first homework assignment, how much moisture did you receive each month from October 1st of 2019 to September 30th of 2020 and up till now? And how does that compare to the monthly, not the total average rainfall? And what I have up here is the total monthly average rainfall for Yuma County. And as you go across the county, those numbers flex a little bit, but in the end, it's a few tenths or even hundreds. It doesn't matter. This will get you in the ballpark. But precipitation is only part of the story. We must go out and look at our range. We've got to see what's happening on the ground. But what do we look at when we're out there? Well, we can do the infamous fence line contrast and see if our neighbors wasted grass last year or not. The only difference from one side of this fence to the other is just the grazing intensity, the management that happened out there. The soils are exactly the same. The potential plant materials are the same. And there are times, I will grant you, that we can get a pretty darn good idea of what's out there, or maybe what's not out there, just by driving by at 65 miles an hour. We can tell at 65 miles an hour that this pasture has been overgrazed. It is quite obvious that the management practices of the grazer have influenced this pasture's ability to recover. No matter what happens precipitation-wise the next year, this pasture will experience drought. But most of the time, if we want to know what's out there, like 99% of the time, if we want to know what's out there, we've got to drive out, we've got to stop the pickup or the four-wheeler, we've got to get out, and we've got to walk around. Take something with you can use to measure relative heights. A yardstick sharpened to a point a little bit, or with a nail or a staple fastened to it somehow so you can stick it in the ground is really helpful. Take your camera too, and I know most of you have cell phones, but make sure you know how to get those pictures off the cell phone first. You can use that yardstick as a walking stick as you walk around. Certainly you can use other modes of measurement. You'll notice a lot of pictures here. I use my keys because I didn't carry the yardstick out with me. You can take a ruler or some other device, your pliers you have on your hip for that height measurement. The problem is they're all kind of short. Even for me, they won't work very well for a walking stick. Now we're walking, remember. Third common misunderstanding. We cannot judge the health or the plant composition of our range by looking across it. And here's a perfect illustration. This piece of range actually looks pretty darn good on the 31st of May, particularly if we consider at this point, the pasture was 31% short for the year, and it was 50% of the average precipitation for the previous year. Most of the green that we have out here is needle and thread. There's some western wheatgrass and some blue grama too. Here is that same piece of ground looking down. What a different view, isn't it? See my pickup key? No, I didn't bring my yardstick. Here's my pickup key to give you a reference point. Our eyes see the tallest stuff, or the most color, or what we most dislike, or what we most like. If we really want to know what's happening on our range, we've got to look down. So what are we looking for? Well, let's start with how much grass is really out there. Roy Roth, many of you know him, CSU Extension Range Specialist, retired now, once made the point to me, the cows don't eat acres, they eat grass. It does not matter how many acres you have, it matters how much grass you have. So how much grass do we really have here? Looking down, we can see just how much grass cover there is. We also get a much clearer picture of what kinds of grass make up this cover, which is the second thing we need to look at when we're out there looking down at our pastures. It's not so important that you know all the names, but you do need to know which ones are tasty and when they are tasty, and which ones are not tasty ever. Blue grama, we all know, is pretty much tasty all year round. But it's not exactly hogging up all the space here, is it? This taller stuff that we see, these tall brown plants right here, this is drop seed. It's not tasty anytime. that ever. On a sandy pasture, we should have 5 to 8 species of grasses. Where are they? And lastly, this green stuff out here, yeah, you know what that is. That's cheatgrass. The next feature to note is what is, or is not, on the surface of the ground. The most important of these are dead plants, bare ground, and litter. Even in the best of conditions, there are plants that die every year. It just happens. But in droughts like 2002, 2012, and last year, those plant losses can be even higher than what's normal. Dead plants won't grow leaves, no matter how much rain you pour on them. When living grasses are dormant, whether it's winter or summer, they have a tan color to them, and you can see them right here. Dead grasses have a black or gray color, like here, in this area, and over here. They're dead. Now, they may send up a new bud, although that's not terribly likely, but the old plants are done. These remnants of leaves that are here, they're not going to turn green. The green plants are 6 weeks fescue or spit out grass. On the yardstick, about half of this 9-inch length is the plants are dead. Well, obviously, we're not going to judge hundreds or thousands of acres based on one 9-inch measurement, but we're going to look at numerous areas and estimate how much of our plant cover is living versus dead. The next characteristic to note is bare ground. Bare ground is a terrifically interesting way to learn that there are a lot of critters out there that don't have any hooves on them at all. In this picture, there's at least 5 species of animals. That's certainly interesting and intriguing, but I really don't recommend that you maintain bare ground so you can track those 2-ounce grazers out on your property. But let's look at what else this photo tells you. Look at where my arrow is. Here, here. What's this? And this right here. What's happening? We've got soil movement. We have erosion happening. This is significant soil movement. Even weeds cannot grow when the ground is moving underneath their feet. Perennial plants certainly aren't going to grow. Bare ground gives us a great place for seed germination and recruitment, and that's great if we're looking to better our pastures, to improve the species that are out there. But it's bad if we've got annuals or undesirable plants looking for new territory. Just like crop ground, bare range ground heats up faster, evaporates more moisture, it soaks in water slower, and it's more likely to wash or blow than ground that's covered. The hotter the ground is, the less friendly it is to plant roots and to the microorganisms living in the soil. Those microorganisms are absolutely essential to release nutrients. Once those little guys die, or if they go into survival mode, it's not like you just pour water on them and they hop back into motion. It takes time for them to reactivate. Litter protects the soil from wind and water erosion. It cools the soil, so the water that soaks in stays in the soil longer without cover. It improves living conditions for the root systems and the microorganisms. The more litter we have, the faster our range will recover, because we'll keep more moisture on the ground and will provide better living conditions for the perennial plants we want. This ground is in good position to begin the drought recovery process. Most of the ground is covered with plant litter, so the moisture that falls will stay in place. The plants here are needle and thread, western wheatgrass, and blue grama. They're all perennial plants that we want. We don't see any actually, cheatgrass or 6 weeks fescue, that's spit out grass, stuff we don't want. This pasture is in a great position to withstand continued drought and to recover quickly once favorable precipitation conditions return. So the first thing we're going to do when the snow melts is to go look at our range. Do not wait for spring. You can learn a lot right now. Remember why we're out on the range. We're trying to get a sense of how healthy our grasses are going into the growing season. Recall the discussion earlier about top growth and root growth. If you had a root viewer, what would you see here? The only tall plants we see are drop seed. A lot of people call it go-back grass. It's the stuff cattle don't eat until they're starving. The short green stuff in November, well, we know what that is. That's cheatgrass. Now, cheatgrass is great feed while it lasts, but if a 1,400-pound cow needs 1,250 pounds of forage per month, is she going to get it here? And if she does get it here, is that going to leave enough cover on the range to protect the soil and the plants? So we're walking out on the range. We're going to take a measuring device and a camera. We're going to walk, not drive. We're going to assess how tall are the remaining plants that are edible. We're going to look down, not across. We're going to look at how much of the ground is covered by native living plants. How many of the plants are living? How many are dead? How much litter is out there? How much bare ground? And if we have bare ground, do we have erosion occurring? What's a swimmer doing in a drought talk? Look at this guy. He has been training 4 hours a day for years. And even though all that training, he is at the point of total exhaustion after just a few minutes of swimming. If we had a picture of him a little later, what do you think he'd look like? Would he still be hanging on that floating lane? Or would he be up and walking about with a spring in his step? Would he be recovered? The look on his face could be your grass plants at this point in the drought. What will the look be when spring comes? The better condition our rangeland is in, the faster it will recover. Many of our pastures have had really hard workout in the last year, even if we didn't graze them at all. And if we grazed them during the drought, or left them short before the drought hit, or more tellingly last year, then we've had multiple hard workouts for our grass. With each workout, the plants have used valuable energy to recover. This energy storage is in the buds, which is what grows into new plants, and in the roots. How many of these plants in this picture are just hanging on the lane marker, like the swimmer we just saw? This rangeland has been hurt badly. The penalty here is substantial. Even with good, slow moisture that soaks in, it's going to take at least 2 years for this ground to be ready to even think about feeding a cow. How many roots do you think these plants have? Moisture does not bring the dead back to life. So every grazing decision we make now and in the growing season should be set against these questions. If I do X, will it help me increase the root mass underground for the existing plants? Will it encourage new plants? Will it leave the plants tall enough to do their job of capturing snow and slowing the wind at the ground surface? Will it increase the amount of litter cover? And will it decrease bare ground? So what about winter grazing? There are many more people feeding hay on rangeland this winter than I have ever noticed before. Supplemental feeding of hay or range cubes or some other protein source every 3 to 4 days to help animals digest dry grass is quite acceptable from both a cow and a range health standpoint. But substitute feeding hay because there's not enough grass on the pasture to feed the cows, that might be okay for the cow, depending on the quality of the feed, but it's never okay for the range, and there's several reasons why. Cattle are grazing animals. Third misunderstanding, even if you are putting out more feed than the recommended 3% of body weight, the animals will go out and graze, looking for plants to meet their nutritional or medicinal needs, or just because that's what they do. Feeding is happening because there isn't enough grass out there to feed the cows. But by feeding, we're making sure that what grass is out there is still being eaten. Trampling in winter is significant, particularly on stressed plants. I've noticed this year, even just the wind and the tumbleweeds blowing around the range is causing noticeable degradation in the standing leaf cover. And while, yeah, that makes litter, which is good, there wasn't enough standing leaves out there in the first place, or the feeding wouldn't be happening. Even my buffalo grass lawn, which I do water when it's dry, will show a path to the woodpile by the time winter is over. And I'm quite certain my husband and I do not weigh as much as a cow, and our feet are not as sharp as cutting hooves. This is not as much of a concern now for pastures that are particularly specifically set aside for winter grazing only. But during a drought, that trampling is more critical than in well-watered years because those plants just aren't as well armored. Wherever the feed is placed, whether you're doing it in round feeders, bunks, or you're rolling it out across the range, the grass under and around that hay is getting trampled or eaten to the ground. This removes all the vertical height protection that standing grass provides to the buds just under the soil surface. The base of the plant and the soil is now exposed to the drying effects of wind and sun, the cutting action of wind-blown snow, and as we know all too well this February, the extreme temperature swings that we can see. I have heard the argument made by people and even other range specialists that feeding hay puts litter on the ground. But my question is it enough? And is it the right type of litter to make up for the loss of native grass that should be making the litter? In most cases, I would argue the answer is a resounding no. An exception might be a blowout area or some area like old cropland that you're trying to revegetate. Otherwise, most of the time, it's not a great thing. Feeding wheat, for example, with a developed head on it will leave lots of litter because the feed's valuable to the cow as the fence posts that are keeping her in the pasture. But wheat straw does not break down well, and it piles up deeply enough that sunlight doesn't reach the ground, and it'll kill whatever grass is still alive. If you need to feed hay to keep your animals in condition, I understand. Please, please move them to a corral or to a designated sacrifice pasture. Please do not substitute feed your cattle on summer or even on winter range. So now let's look to the growing season. We've got to properly anticipate how much the demand will be. That's not so hard. Anticipating how much supply we have, that's tricky because we don't know how much the grass is going to grow. And we've got to keep that livestock demand significantly less than forage supply following drought. The good news in all of this is that there are some pretty darn neat tools out there that can help draw a general picture of the situation. If you combine that information with the specifics that you know about your property and your honest assessment from when you walked out on the range, then you can get at least yourself in the ballpark of where you ought to be for this year. So some websites to watch as the winter progresses into early spring. The Drought Monitor, we're all familiar with that. There's something called the Evaporative Stress Index. It's a pretty cool little tool. It only works during the growing season, which is why the picture here ends October 27th. It's the very end of the growing season for us. But you can see it's just like the Drought Monitor. The dark red is not good. Look how much dark red and red is in eastern Colorado. It gives you an idea, you know, what's going on. Help you keep from biasing your view. There's also this little thing called the ACES Climate Maps. Pretty cool little gadget. You go to its website, you can tell it how many months you want it to look back, and it draws you an overall picture. What's the moisture been overall? Again, it's using these weather stations, just like the Drought Monitor does. It may not accurately or precisely represent what's going on at your property, but it sure shows you the general gist of what's going on out there. Then there's this nice fact sheet that's come out recently called Early Warning for Stocking Decisions in Eastern Colorado. I encourage you to go get that drought sheet and read it. The URL is enormously huge and uncumbersome to try and put up for you. So I recommend you just type Early Warning Eastern Colorado or Early Warning for Stocking in your favorite search engine. You'll find it. Basically, it's drawing the picture that the ocean temperatures are indicating that we're in for another drought year this year. And then lastly, there's a new initiative started by CSU called Drought Advisors. You can send an email to these folks. It includes a whole team of people that are range specialists, economists, business managers that can help you figure out where you are and how to best survive the economics of everything that's been going on lately. So some things to watch for as we get into closer to the growing season. Grass cast. I hope most of you have at least heard this. I've put out several news or articles about it. Grass cast takes the evaporative demand of the area and compares it to long term. It's quite a complicated science, but actually draws a pretty decent picture of what to expect. The exact level may not be perfect, but it certainly puts you in the ballpark. Again, look at eastern Colorado. We're anywhere from 5 below long-term average productivity to more than 30% below expected long-term productivity. Again, helps you kind of refine and keep you from unwittingly biasing your assessments of where you are. And then there's a site called Veggie Dry. It takes reports from folks all over that send them into the website and draws a picture of where are we with vegetation. Again, it doesn't work very well in the drought, or I mean in the dormant season, but once growing season starts coming in, when we get into April, watch for these two sites and see what they're indicating. Huh? These were the days, weren't they? At least if you're a Bronco fan. Like a good football team, you need to have a playbook that's been well thought out long before you hit the field. This guy, old number 18 here, he didn't go out in the field and then say, well, let's create a new plan. He might change the play based on the situation at the line of scrimmage, but it is not a new creation that he made at that heat of the moment. That play clock is ticking, and by the time old number 18 calls for the ball, there's very little time left. His decision had to be put in motion before the clock ran out. If it isn't, or wasn't, it's going to be a delay of game penalty. Ranchers, your play clock is ticking. Decision has to be made before it runs out. If we don't get the play in motion before the play clock runs out, the penalty we pay is far higher than 5 yards. We may be forcing a change in plant communities that results in lower livestock carrying capacity. This is a huge penalty that will last for years, or maybe even decades. Some of you are on that kind of ground. So through years of experience and hours of training, this quarterback assembled a great deal of knowledge from a variety of sources. This knowledge gives him an indication of what plays are likely to work in each of the situations. He studied his film, listened to coaches and other players, and he practiced. This preparation gives him the ability to adapt in the heat of the moment. Notice how the play in the response column on the far right is different depending on where they are in the game, the score, and the defensive arrangement. So, what's some of the things that we know? There's been some work done across the Great Plains that shows that the 30 days prior to peak grass growth is the best indicator of potential grass growth. Let me reword that. The 30 days of moisture, the moisture received up to 30 days prior to peak grass growth, that's the best indicator of potential grass growth. Our peak growth in eastern Colorado is mid-June to mid-July, somewhere in there. So the rain that falls after that 30 days prior, so the midpoint of our peak grass growth is mid-July, 30 days prior to that would actually be June 15th. I fudged a little and said after July 1st. If we get great rain after that, we're going to have big seed heads waving high in the breeze. We're not going to grow a lot of leaves and forage. The window's already passed. So what needs to go into our playbook, our quarterback ranch playbook? Well, what are the situation questions? How did the pasture finish the growing season the last 2 years? Now, you didn't take measurements. Use your best memory. How much moisture is in the soil profile on various days in the early spring and early summer? How much standing grass is there on each of these days? And is the grass really growing, or is it just green? Measure it, find out. Remember, green does not mean growing. Here's some actual examples, parts of some rancher playbooks. Notice they have trigger dates. Rain begets grass. They have flexibility. These animals go. They stick with the options in the playbook. They are not making a new one. This kind of planning needs to be done at the kitchen table or the meeting room or across the hood of the truck with all those affected by the decisions when we have time and less stress to think about what management to apply in the situation. This is not a heat of the battle project. You know, when the cows are out of grass, these scenarios, the indicators you'll use to decide which situation you're in, and all the management actions that need to be thought out, need to be thought out now to the best of your ability during the winter. While you're making your plan, reach out to the team at Drought Advisors. See if they can provide you with some insights, some useful things. Go to drought.unl.edu, the National Drought Mitigation website. This place is full of great information and resources to help you. One of them is the drought planning section. It features ranchers with drought plans and tips from them about how to make those moves sooner so they survive, they're more likely to survive than those who wait until they're out of grass. Until your ranch, where your cows get their sustenance, has had at least one full growing season of near average precipitation, with grass production also near expected with grass productions also near the expected pounds, the pounds of forage demanded by the animals needs to be substantially less than half of the expected pounds of forage supply. Now, many of your neighbors, their balance looks like this. And now they're in trouble because they did not leave enough grass out there to regrow the roots, to protect itself, or to protect the soil. So, when can you turn cattle into the pasture this year? The answer, when you've got enough standing grass to feed the cows and still have enough leaves to feed the plant, or a reasonable person would believe the leaves will grow. Remember, 30 days prior, the moisture up to 30 days prior of peak growth is the best determiner of how much grass we'll have out there. If we're dry this spring, is it reasonable to expect that the leaves will regrow? Take half, leave half. It's a great measure when conditions are average. The problem is it deceives the person into believing that there's always something for the cattle to take. So no matter how much or how little grass grows, there's still half that can be allocated to the animal. But does that really work? Do you think that's true? So let's just think about this. If take half, leave half is a good goalpost, the sands, when the plants are 12 to 15 inches tall, with good soil coverage, and production expected around 1,600 pounds. What happens when those plants are only 5 to 8 inches tall and there's open spaces in between them and total production expected is only 600 pounds? For shortgrass folks, but take half, leave half is a good goalpost when plants are top out at 6 to 8 inches tall, when you've got good plant coverage, dense, and total production is in that 12 to 1,400 pound range. So what happens when the plants are only 2 to 3 inches tall, with dead plants between the living ones and total production of 400 pounds? Do you think we can still take half and not damage the plant root system? If the plants need to have 6 to 7 inches of stubble for the sands and 3 to 4 inches of stubble for the shortgrass in good years, don't they need at least that much in a bad year? Take half, leave half is a recipe for disaster in dry years. And part of that's because we don't know what the total is going to be till the end of the growing season. And it's a little late then to determine what the half is. This photo here is a great illustration. It's a tall sandgrass called prairie sandreed. Remember, I told you it's not so important to remember the names. It's a good sandgrass. The pastures were grazed in June of 2013, and a 6-inch stubble is perfectly reasonable height. But what happened? Even though this plant received 150% of the total average rainfall, only managed to grow a few leaves after the grazing event. So what happened? Okay, the photo was taken in 2014. Remember, I said it was grazed in June of 2013. So what happened the year before? 2012. Remember, acres don't feed cows. Grass feeds cows. No matter how much it rains, plants that are dead are not going to grow. Water and nutrients that are below the root depth do not feed the plant. We have to work with what we have. We have to take the time to see where we are by walking all of our pastures. We have to see how many of them look like the pasture on the right. How many of them look like the pasture on the left? Now remember, this is the picture I told you not to take, the one that looks across the rangeland, but I can tell you, if it looks bad looking across the rangeland, I have never seen it look better when I got out there. We still need to look down. As I said, we're going to look down, not across the pasture. We're going to see how much grass cover we have. Taking a yardstick or ruler, something is helpful. Longer is better, so you get a better perspective. We're going to pay attention to the kinds of grasses we have. Are they yummy or are they yucky? Are you going to note the colors of the grass? Are they tan, living, or are they black or dark gray? All this dark stuff out here, this is dead. Lastly, we're going to pay attention to how much bare ground we have versus litter. We're going to sum this all together. We can draw some really reasonable conclusions about how the grass system is doing, and how the roots are doing underneath. And that's the lifeblood of the plants. If the plants are short, like we see here, it's reasonable to expect the roots are equally short. So what's green out here? These little tufts. Not cheatgrass. It's 6 weeks fescue or spit out grass. Look how much is out here. This pasture is in deep trouble. If a grazer puts cattle out on it next spring, the cattle, every time they get a mouthful of blue grandma, they're going to get a mouthful of this yucky stuff, and they're going to spit the whole darn thing out. There isn't any litter here. There wasn't enough leaves to make litter. So like good football players preparing for the game, we're going to make a playbook before we hit the field. Before spring comes. We're going to think of all the things the defense, Mother Nature might throw at us. And we're going to write down what our response is going to be. We're going to decide what conditions are going to tell us on what days. We're going to pick out what animals we're going to put in the pasture and which animals are going to go somewhere else. What is the route for the wide receivers? Those animals that don't make the cut. We're going to note the precipitation. We're going to note temperature. We're going to note soil moisture. You'll be planting fence posts. Active growth versus greenness. Remember, green does not mean growing. For each date and possible combination of conditions, we're going to make a planning step or an action to take. We're going to be specific and we're going to write it down. We're not going to put it right here, because you know what happens up here when things start going south? We hit the little panic button, little guy inside of there that overwrites all our logical thinking, and we go to an emotional thinking. We're going to write it down. We're going to commit to it, and we're going to do it now. We're going to make absolutely sure that we leave enough of the grass that grows this year to feed the root system and replace lost energy storage. Just as that Olympian we saw earlier needs to recover, our grasses need to recover. This site is a great example of a site treated well for drought. No, I don't have my yardstick, but here's a key so you can get a sense of how tall the grass really is. There's great litter out here. Look at the stubble height next to these keys. We've got species we want to have. There's plenty of growing season in late June for it to have full recovery. The soil and the plants are armored against another drought year. There's a lot of great resources out there to learn more about grazing management. Here's a couple, one published by UNL called Skillful Grazing Management on Semi-Arid Rangelands. You can download it or get it off the website here. Here's another one. I give this out to every person I meet, Grass the Stockman's Crop. If you do not have this brochure, ask for it. All the NRCS offices have it. And yes, we're closed because of the COVID, but you can give us a call. We'll mail it to you. We can set it outside for you. Get this brochure and read it. It talks about everything I've talked about today and more, with more detail and not nearly as fast. We must manage our grass to be the best it can be under the current conditions. We've got to let it recover as quickly as possible when rains return by putting it in that best position. And we've got to prepare it for the next drought. Because remember, acres don't feed cows, grass feeds cows. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, Julie, I do have a question for you.
All right.
It's regards to range management. One of the tools that they always talk about is using your cell phone and returning to the same spots, having that consistent measure and look at the same time each year to develop that. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, don't we? I meet with so many people and I do it myself. Man, I wish I had pictures of this 5 years ago. Yeah, we can't go back and get those pictures 5 years ago, but start now. Make us do. It's great to have a specific spot you go to. Be careful where you pick it. I always say be at least a quarter mile away from water source or something else that attracts the cows where there's extra traffic. Don't put it right next to the fence because there's a lot more traffic again right there next to the fence. But do have a spot that you can go back out to and take pictures because that is a great way to track. Across the pasture is fine, but do make sure you're taking one looking down too, because that across the pasture picture does tell you something about heights of plants and maybe some of the plant composition out there, but looking down tells you what's actually happening at the soil surface. The other thing, Travis, would be to make sure you're doing it at about the same time of the year. So if you go out on June 15th, try and go out the middle of June every year to take the picture. Because if you take it at June 15th and the next year you take it in October 15th and the next year you take it in August 15th, well, different plants are expressing themselves through those time periods, and our eyes, again, like I mentioned earlier, will see what's most prominent. And so it can look like we're having huge changes in our pasture, and really all we're doing is just changing the season. So we're seeing different expressions of the plants.
Following along the same line, if we are going to actually take a clipping as a producer, what time do you recommend is best for those of us in Eastern Colorado to get those clippings?
I would do it at the end of the growing season, Travis, because that tells us what's actually grown, what the whole growth, what our total production was for the year, if that's the intent of the clipping. Now, a clipping might be the intent of the clipping is just to see, well, how much poundage have we gained since a month ago? In which case, you take it the next month. But usually when we're clipping grasses, we're looking for that total production because we're trying to draw a picture of what should our stocking level be? How many animals per acre? Well, how many acres per animal should we be allocating? We've got a lot of old wives' tales, I would say, those numbers, 2 acres or 3 acres, and they just aren't applicable to the cows that we have today or the conditions that the rangeland is in.
Well, that kind of ties into my 2 questions. I want to thank you very much, Julie, for being part of this program. And
thank you for the opportunity.
I hope that everybody tunes in on February 25th at 5 p.m. We'll do a roundtable Zoom. If you guys have questions, Julie will be available. So thank you guys very much. And we hope that you have enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you.